Hey guys, GHAZZY TV here with another Diablo 4 video. In this one, I'm going to be tier listing the Necromancer builds available to us, and the information I have is going to be based off information that will not break the NDA, as this is recorded before the May 30th, 6 p.m. CEST. I'm going to start with this by saying that I'm going to go through four different Necromancer builds, one being Minion, Shadow, Bone, and Blood. And outside of this, I do want to lead by referencing Adam Jackson's Twitter post. And for those of you who don't know who Adam Jackson is, he is the lead class designer for Diablo 4 Blizzard Entertainment. This is his personal account, obviously, so these tweets are his own. But in this, he is making a statement saying that their goal for the Necromancer was to have 3 main fantasies, not 4. Blood, Bone, and Shadow, 2 different core skills for each, and a sub-type of army versus non-army for players to choose. This indicates that there was never any intentions for Blizzard to actually have any approach of using minion focus as an actual fantasy that you could engage with and focus on. Obviously, we will be doing everything we can to make sure that that is a playable way for the Necromancer to run with, because a lot of people want to do this. Hopefully this will change further down the road, or maybe if they patch it early, I have no idea. But with the current state of things, there's a few problems with a minion-focused Necromancer, and I'll be tackling that. This doesn't mean that it will be completely unplayable. I do believe there are ways to making this actually a functional subtype of play or main fantasies to focus on. But due to its core design with the approach that they have for the Necromancer class, it will realistically always be inferior compared to the other 3 variants. Now, with that said, we're going to move on and actually go into the actual tier listing of these things. And we're going to talk about minions builds first. Now, the thing is with minions is that they are going to be a bit lackluster, and I will be putting these as a very low... they are at a disadvantage compared to any other build, which is problematic in my opinion. So in my opinion, I'm going to put them at a C tier as an overall result. Compared to the other classes or the other build types for Necromancers. So we're going to go through some categories to consider where I would place a minion-focused Necromancer build. Now, this type of builds can be done in a variety of ways. For example, if we look at the Minion Necromancer that I threw together, it's a Miasma Necromancer. There is a Paragon board that will be focusing on Cult Leader, Hulking Monstrosities, and into Center Death, mainly for the stats that you can use in the Paragon boards to ramp up the defenses and offensive scaling very effectively. And also Center Death will give you that extra layers of defense through the corpses being nearby. So that's how the Paragon boards is basically designed. And there will be a build guide for this listed in the descriptions below later. At Icy Vein's website as well. This is currently not done at the time of this recording. So, gear and skills, I'm going to go through them real quick. The idea of this is to have Reaper Skeletons generate corpses for us in a very effective way. We're going to run the main damage source, which actually is the Bone Skeletons that is going to take their own life to deal damage. And it's also going to have a Blood Golem for reducing damage taken. Now, this can be changed to other things as well if you prefer. So we're going to talk about a couple things in the tier list, and that is the categories to consider: leveling, group play, solo play, endgame, etc, etc. We're going to go through all of this, and the overall landing is, as mentioned, at a C tier for the minions. So I'm going to talk real brief about certain things with the aspects. Now, this is obviously what I'm expecting to see on a high-end version of this build, and the main damage source that we're looking at is Aspect of Frenzied Dead. Some people like to run the Unyielding Commander. The problem with this is that the Army of Dead has a 90-second cooldown, and running Unyielding on your two-handed weapon for the best scaling of this is incredible amount of damage. Once every 1.5 minutes. Let me be the first person to say, fuck that. If you want to have an effective gameplay with a build like this, you want to have consistent high performance. The best way to achieve that is to run the attack speed as aspect on your weapon instead, because of how much damage you can pull off with this modifier alone, especially with the Bone Necromancers. Mace Skeletons, sorry. Outside of that, it's important to run things like Hardened Bones for their survival, as well as the animation for more damage output, and also very important running the plus number of skeletons from Blood Getters and Vicious Aspect. And we're also looking at the protecting aspect for as a panic button in case you get, or a panic effect if you get hit when you're low HP. But most importantly, Aspect of Disobedience allows you to ramp up armor. So those are like kind of the to-go-to choices for efficiency with a build like this. And the main problem we have with the minion-focused Necromancers is the fact that if you want to use a Golem and your Skeletons, that's already taking 2 slots in your action bar. Outside of that, you also want to use Army of the Dead. That's 3 skills in your action bar. That means you have 3 left. That's a lot of notes taken. Now, one of the best ways for Necromancer to be used in both solo and party play is to use Decrepify as a curse. It's just so effective because of how much damage you can lower from the enemy's output and slow them at the same time. Suddenly, you only have 2 skills to choose from now. And Minion Necromancers has 2 abilities that you can choose from. There is literally only one possible optimal way to do this in a good way. And that is literally to run Blight with Corpse Explosion. Now, why is this the case? You don't care about the basic, because you're going to run with Hued Flesh and Grim Harvest, and the corpses generated by your skeletons will allow you to resummon your minions and pop the priest from oversummoning, so to say, which will heal your minions. But you can run the Corpse Explosion with a Blighted Corpse Explosion. Blighted. And then you have this one to make them take more damage to the enemies if they're affected by Blight. Now, this slows the enemies even further, but it allows you to utilize the Reaper's Pursuit. You get movement speed because minions or necromancers in general lacks mobility. And then you have the possibility to allow you to have some stuns on them for stagger and stuff like that. And obviously make them take increased damage. So this is the only possible way to utilize those 2 last skills. And it's just absolutely disgusting to see how little variation you can do with a minion-focused necromancer, because the diversity is just out the window. So the problem we have is that, without breaking the NDA here, is that even if you pick up all of these nodes, even if your minions are taking 45% maximum damage per hit, if you encounter something that hits really hard, they can't do more than 45% damage on your minions. That means your minions are still able to be 2 or 3 shot, or 2 shot plus a small hit in between, or a dot in between, right? But you can heal them every 5 seconds, which will heal them for 60% of their life. Enemies hits more than once every 5 seconds, I can tell you that much. So the problem with this in general puts us in a category where the investment to their survival is very, very, very important. And without having exact details of what scales them and what doesn't scale them, I think it's very crucial to understand that we just have to play with it and see what works. And people have talked about that equipping a shield will work for them and stuff like that, but armor is going to increase their survivability, which is very, very important to understand. Which means that jewelry, such as the skulls, will give them armor. Having things like Aspect of the Obedience will give them armor, and all of these things will help them survive. But most importantly, the Paragon board gives them tons of defensive layers through the different nodes you can pick up from the Cult Leader, as well as into Hulky Monstrosity. So these stats are very, very crucial to pick up for the build to make it actually work. This makes me feel like the minion-focused Necromancer should be working much better after the leveling section, and just struggle so much with the endgame content through the campaign, and as you progress further towards the capstone dungeon into World Tier 3. Now, I can't give you details of this because of the NDA, but my personal opinion on it is that in leveling, they are C tier, essentially. They're just absolutely terrible at leveling. Because of the struggles that they're going to bring and lack of damage, because you're not going to have a full set of legendaries. You're going to be switching your gear often. You might have 1 or 2 legendary powers that you put in your rings, for example, and that's it. And that's just not going to be enough to create a smooth leveling experience. Group play, because of the fact that they barely have any damage and they're in a really poor situation when it comes to efficiency during the leveling, I think that they're not really that good. For endgame, again, because of the fact that they require so many Paragon points before they start to actually perform at a decent level, again, you got to put them at a C tier. And besides that, solo play would be the exact same thing. It would just be a C tier, because it's just not good enough. Endgame, I can't actually answer for this, because the way it's perceived, and because I don't want to break the NDA, I do believe at the end game they're going to be a C tier, but again, I can't really say for sure, again, because I can't break the NDA. And this is, again, because if you have a situation where the company itself is saying that Bone Shadow Necro is up here, and they're focusing on them being viable, contesting build types, and your minions is down here. When you get to the Paragon point, which is essentially making minions viable or functional, these builds gets better. So you have good builds becoming better. You have a terrible build becoming functional. They're still going to be behind everything else. Gear dependent, rare modifiers, and legendary powers. I think that minions builds is very, very heavy on the requirement of gear in general from both rare modifiers as well as legendary powers, because of their survivability and their damage output is essentially gated exclusively around how good gear you're putting on. So because of this, I feel like this is also something I would categorize as a C tier. in the sense of the minion focus. Speed, don't even get me started. I'm going to put a C here, and I'm not going to say much there, because again, you just lack of mobility skills from a Necromancer on top of the build, not doing good damage and forcing you to resummon minions a lot is going to put them at a very bad speed approach. Casual friendly, since the build's going to struggle, well, guess what? It's going to be a C tier, because it's going to struggle all the way through. And then hardcore viability, we should put an F there, and the reason for that is if you are not able to consistently, reliably have your minions alive during the leveling section, you're not going to have a comfortable experience playing hardcore with a build like this. In the end game, it might feel better, but till then, it's going to be absolute terrible compared to builds that are better by default. So this is why I'm putting minion builds at a C tier in the current state. Hopefully, we'll see some changes to this when it comes to some patches. Maybe a day one patch can be the saving grace for the minion build. So that's why they're sitting there. So we can go ahead and look at blood first. And the reason I'm going to look at blood is because I would actually put blood at a overall B tier. And the reason for this is very simple. I'm going to go through every step for this. And first I'm going to show you a rough draft of the blood necromancer that I have on the build guides. You can check that out on the descriptions below. Obviously, you don't need a unique item. This can be replaced with a legendary till you get there. So when it comes to the blood necromancer, I think that this is one of the most comfortable and straightforward and easy to play builds. I do believe it has the lowest performance of the other three build types of necromancer, but it is very, very comfortable. When it comes to the legendary powers, again, you want to run the aspect of disobedience because this build is straight up going to be tanking enemies. And you're also having two offensive scaling modifiers for this specific one. One is the blood-bathed aspect, allowing you to echo your blood surge for that exclusively juicy clearing, because you actually hit really hard. I can't say more than that because of NDA, but it's nice. Single target is going to require to run a Bloodlance aspect, and that will ramp up your single target. You could run Blood Surge for single target. I didn't feel that was too comfortable, so using Bloodlance was better. When it comes to your minions, we are sacrificing the the skeletons for the defenders for more defenses. We're sacrificing bone skeletons for the overpower damage. And then I am sacrificing the blood golem. You could run a golem here and using the reduced damage taken, which is absolutely fine to do. I actually had more success with the way I've been playing with sacrificing it, but it's a matter of personal preference. Skill tree wise, very straightforward. We're maxing out hemorrhage. We're getting both Bloodlance and Blood Surge. We're running the Living Essence there. It's actually very comfortable. Value points in Blood Mist. We're having Decrepify because of how strong it is. All of the points except the minion healing blood orbs here on the blood misc nodes, and a blood wave as a utility option, and again more defensive nodes through standalone and memento mori, and obviously death's reach. And then we're obviously taking the Rightmost Vigor. This very, very baseline, very straightforward and easy to understand pathing. The Paragon board itself is very simple. We go for Bloodbath into blood because blood, and finishing up with Bone Graft. And the reason we're taking Bone Graft has nothing to do with the legendary power, which is over here. We're only taking this because we can get access to extra defensive layers through the Tenacity rare node and another glyph into Erudite for even more defensive layers. So this is just to bum rush another sockets. But most importantly is the Bloodbath and the blood boards when it comes to these things. I do have a video about Paragon board progression, so if you want to check that out, look at the descriptions below. There's a link there. So, where would we then categorize a Blood Necromancer? So, when it comes to leveling, I think that the leveling approach is not that bad. I would say that the leveling would be more of an A tier, and the reason I would say that it's an A tier is the fact that Blood Surge is so comfortable to play with, and the build's designed to tank. As long as you're running the aspect of disobedience and you're having the Blood Surge Echo, it's actually very comfortable to level with. It's not the fastest because of the damage. The efficiency of your damage is very much gated around the gearing and how you're scaling the modifiers in your gear. So leveling is good, but it could be better. For group play, I feel like, yeah, if your group doesn't have a designated tanky character that's supposed to be up front, soaking up all the hits from enemies, then it could be really good. I would put this at a B tier, mainly because we don't have any sort of tools that gives this build speed in the form of mobility, which the Shadow approach does. Even the Minion Necro would be faster in that sense than this build because of that approach. On the other hand, this build doesn't have to keep distance from your enemies, but I would say that for group play, it's kind of a B tier, whereas I would put this at a B tier for solo play as well compared to the other builds. Again, we're doing this tier listing is based on comparing the build versus the other necromancer types, not versus other classes. For endgame, I would still put this at a B tier because, again, I feel like both Bone and Shadow will be outperforming this build significantly, but it is very easy to play, which is why I'm also going to be talking about the speed, like I mentioned, would be a C in this one, but casual friendly will be an A tier because how easy it is to understand. I mentioned earlier how important it is for gear dependent this build is. You want to make sure you have actual life on your gear. It's insanely good for this build. Essence cost reduction is great. You can have even attack speed for hemorrhage is fine, but overpower damage and stuff like that, and damage whilst you're healthy is crazy good and will scale this build very, very well. So I'd say that for a gear dependent, it's very high. So I'm just going to put a high in here. Hardcore viability, as long as you're progressing the build and designing it the way it's supposed to be designed with gear modifiers, I think that if you level with another build, such as a classical Bone with corpses, Corpse Explosion Necromancer, and then switch around either Capstone Dungeon or after the Capstone Dungeon, I think that for hardcore viability, this build could be in a B tier as well, because I still think that both Bone and Shadow would outperform it. So this is essentially the listings that I would place the Blood Necromancer build in general compared to the other builds as well. So we're going to go talk about the Bone Necromancer, and this one is a bit special because a lot of people are placing Bone as the best Necromancer build, and I am not. I am not placing the Bone Necromancer as the best Necromancer build for endgame. I think that overall, this is going to be an A tier, and the reason for this is that I firmly believe that the Shadow Necromancer is just better and more comfortable playing for the highest endgame. I am confident that Bone Necromancer has the possibility to reaching the most insane endgame damage numbers, but despite that, I would still argue that the Shadow Necromancer would be a more comfortable and better overall build to play at the highest endgame with the tools available to it for those best in slot pieces. So that's why I'm putting Necromancer at an A tier. So if we look at leveling, Bone is the way to go for leveling. This is without a doubt the S tier of leveling. Even my leveling guide for Necromancer is an S tier. Group play. So here's the thing with group play. I think that people are neglecting the importance of certain aspects of the Bone Necromancer, or what a Necromancer brings to the table. One is obviously the approach of Decrepify, and people seem to undervalue Decrepify very much. So let's go into the Bone Necromancer and show you this real quick. Decrepify is allowing you to apply 51% slow, but 24% less damage dealt to start with, just like that, which is insanely strong. Permanent uptime, if you will. The other thing it does is guaranteeing with Bone Spears through Splintering Aspects, and even before Splintering Aspect is collected, you go for this node, allowing you to guarantee vulnerable debuff on the enemies, 100% uptime on AoE packs. And since it hits pretty much everything on the screen, it actually does really, really well. What it sucks ass at is keeping the fuck up. And that's the speed problem. So as long as you're playing in a group and you're putting the best movement speed boots or a double evade pair of boots, you give them to the Necromancer so that Necromancer can keep up. If you have a Barb in the team, make sure that Barb puts the shout so the Necromancer gets that help. Basically, the Necromancer in the group play is the wheelchair guy that you need to help. Right? He has a disability. Push him forward and the entire group will thrive because of the efficiency that the Necromancer brings to the table. Solo play, I'd again put this at a freaking S tier. I think that solo play Necromancer is just so simple to play, especially with the Bone Necro. Endgame, again, I'm putting this at an S tier for endgame. And then gear dependent. I don't think that the gear dependency is that crazy, but I would say that I would put this on a mediocre. If I can spell mediocre, a gear dependency for the Bone Necromancer. And speed, I would put the speed at a B tier when it comes to the Bone Necromancer. Casual friendly, I put it up at an A. And hardcore viability, I'd put it at an A if you play accordingly. I think this is basically the tier listing that I would put on a Bone Necromancer generally. I think it's just a very solid all-around approach. I'm going to show you the rough draft I have on my guide. This is using a unique, replace it with a legendary if you will. The most important aspect, disobedience, if I can find it. Actually, this is the BIS slot, isn't it? Sorry. Right. So you use disobedience when you're playing it instead of the unique item, and this is something you would replace later because of the surging glass cannon approach damage that you can actually pull off later on. What's really cool with this is actually the fact that you can get to the point where you can have a permanent uptime of your Bone Storm, and this would actually argue for you to use the Golem instead of the Blood Mist to again remove that kind of defensive layer.
Welcome.
Outside of that, we are sacrificing Skirmishers, we're sacrificing Cold Skellies, and we're sacrificing Iron Golem to scale our bones. And the most important aspect for damage output is the splintering aspect. And then when you're leveling, you want to have disobedience, like I mentioned earlier, but that's it. Just splintering aspect is more than enough. Paragon board is very simple. We're going to bomb rush the Bone Graft. This is for the legendary node just being so crazy for this build. Next up, we would rush over to Flesh Eater, and then also pick up Scent of Death for more defensive layers. That's essentially the boards. Again, there's a link in the description for the Paragon board progression. Do you want to check that out? Skill tree wise, we're actually maxing out the Bone Splinter. On this specific version, this is the BIS slot that we have a rough draft of, which is actually going in for the Bone Storm with permanent Bone Storm approach. This is not in the generic build guide for early stage progression. This is the BIS approach, as it's using the Osseo scale aspect to further scale the duration of our Bone Storm to create that permanent uptime of it. So with that said, I think that the Bone Necromancer is one of the best ways to play the high-end game with Bone Necromancers in general. And I would still place this lower than the Shadow build. So where do we then place the approach of Shadow? Now, I would place this as an S tier. I'm going to show you the rough draft that we have on the Shadowmancer here. Link for this guide is in the description below. Again, unique items can be replaced with legendaries. Very important to have aspect of disobedience, even in the BIS items slot, because the Shadowmancer is actually going to be tanking enemies. And there's a couple things that's really important here. For the best in slot piece, we are again going for permanent Bone Storm uptime with the ultimate Shadow, turning the Bone Storm into a Shadow or Darkness ability. However, this does promote the idea of not sacrificing your Golem, which means you'd have to drop one of your abilities for that, and that would have to be looked into. In this link that I have here, we're sacrificing the Reaper Skeletons, we're sacrificing Cold Skellies, and the Bone Golem. We are also looking at a Paragon board that is scaling into the idea of running with Wither, and then we're bum rushing Scent of Death as well as the Flesh Eater. At the Flesh Eater, we're not taking the legendary nodes, we're just doing this for the extra nodes and the glyph, and we're also picking up Bone Graft on the left-hand side. Same thing there. So it's mostly about picking up most of your nodes goes into the Wither section, and then after that, we're just taking 3 extra glyphs after that from the other boards, essentially. Skill tree wise, we're going to run a Reap for Guaranteed Corpse, Blight into the Supernatural Blight, and focusing on Sever. Huge Flash with Corpse Explosion to Blighted. You could move the Corpse Explosion points and move them into Blight, because it can sometimes lead to better damage output. Grim Harvest, Decrepify, crazy good. Death's Embrace for defenses. Running Necrotic Carapace to make sure that we're always being Fortify and having these nodes. This will allow us to have Reaper's Pursuit, allowing us to get a ton of extra speed. And then we're also running the Bone Storm. Again, this is the best in slot approach that I would consider running, and I would consider moving Corpse Explosion points for Blight. That's basically the thing I would change in this specific approach. When it comes to the offensive scaling, I think that for the non-best in slot piece setup, I think that Aspect of Decay is insanely good. The more you can scale the Shadow Blight key passive allows you to ramp up single target damage to such insane levels that is just disgusting. The amount of damage you can pull on the approach of world bosses or harder endgame bosses is crazy. Like, absolutely disgusting. I don't even know where to begin when it comes to that point. So where do we then put this tier list for the Shadow? I think that for leveling, I would say that it's an A tier. I'd say that it's a bit behind the Bone Necromancer because of how effective the Bone Spear is right now. For group play, since you are not reliably applying vulnerability, I put it at a B tier. It's definitely a really, really good one. You still provide CC in the form of the slow. You're providing a lot of stagger and stuns. It's crazy good. But the problem is that the miasma makes you barely see anything on the screen, which is not that fun for group play. But at least it can keep up a bit better. For solo play, I'd put it an A because it's so comfortable to play that when you're low on essence, you still do a ton of damage. You don't really feel like you're out of resources. Now you don't do any damage. So it feels very, very good to play this build, and it tanks everything. Endgame, I put it at an S tier because I believe that this has the capabilities of becoming one of the most comfortable way of playing the game. Gear dependent. Now, I have a lot of comments I want to put here when it comes to stuff that will break the NDA. So ask me about this after the NDA breaks, and I will let you know. Gear dependent, none in the early when you're playing the game. That's all I can say. It's crazy. Speed, it's definitely an A because it's better than any of the other approaches because you get that extra movement speed. So it's better than those, but still it is slower than most other classes. Casual friendly. I think that the casual friendliness of this build is an S tier simply because it can actually tank everything in a very effective way and actually be a much more comfortable way of playing because of how it's designed with the extra CC and stuns. You're staggering and stunning bosses as well. It's just so comfortable, making this a very casual friendly approach, which also makes me believe that for hardcore viability, I would put the S tier as well. And the reason for that is that unlike the Bone Necromancer, you're still doing tons of damage, but you're staggering and stunning enemies, slowing them down, lowering the damage output, and providing fortification and defensive layers. And not only that, due to the playstyle of this build, you don't have to face tank everything. You can lower your DPS output by stepping away and doing a little bit less damage, but the enemies are going to get stunned, staggered, slowed, but you can keep a safe distance, so if you need to, making this one of the best approaches for hardcore viability, in my opinion, for the Necromancer build. So that's basically where I would put the Necromancer in terms of tier listing the different builds within it. And the placement I would put a Necromancer compared to other classes and other tier lists that I've seen, just generally speaking, I would straight up put the Necromancer as probably the second best build in the game for solo play. And I would arguably say that for group play, I definitely agree that both Barbarian is the most desired class for party play, and the second most desired class is a Druid. And I would, without a doubt, in any give and take, always include a Necromancer as a third class in a party play. Like the Decrepify, the damage output with the Bone Spear and stuff like that, it's just too good to not have in your party, as long as you make sure that the party is helping the Necromancer keeping up with the party because of that lack of speed. If you do that, the Necromancer becomes such an insanely strong addition to a party play. That's my take on the Necromancer tier listing. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and check out the guys listed in the descriptions below. On the launch, I'll be racing to the level 100 first Necromancer. I'll do so in softcore to not be participating in the races in hardcore at all. I don't want to create any sort of unfair advantage since I've had access to the press release. And I know we can't claim the reward. I still want to do this in softcore to just avoid being part of that race at all and just do that in softcore. So if you want to check that out, and you can always swing by the Twitch channel.tv/GHAZZY. And we're also part of the supporter streamers. So if you want to get that extra juicy transmog item in game, you can do so by supporting the channel by gifting 2 subs in there. Anyways, enough with the sellout shit. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Till then, can't even speak. Till then, stay safe. Keep rocking.